Greetings. This is Julian K. Smith Jr.'s children's book analysis of Who Was Booker T. Washington. A few main points of the book are through self-determination and friendship, dreams can be achieved. We also see from this book that Booker T. Washington's humility with dignity is an important aspect of intelligence. We also see from this book that reading is very important, and children can learn that going to school and learning from their teacher is good for their future. Even brushing their teeth and being clean indicates intelligence and discipline. Those are just a few points that children can learn from this book on Booker T. Washington. A few more points is that they can learn that Mr. Washington walked up from slavery to earn his education. And even though segregation was legal, he still worked with white people and black people together to support black education. And students can also be inspired how Mr. Washington allowed his students to plan, design, and build their own school buildings at Tuskegee. The author presents the message well in being presented through a comic book style, as well as highlighting the contrasting differences between W.B. Du Bois and Mr. Washington. And he also shows that Mr. Washington was a family man. The observations of the illustrated message were that it illustrated a fitting form of historical interpretation, and color imagery may have more impact on younger readers as the book was presented in black and white. Now, the national context of Booker T. Washington as he emerged on the scene as a leader after he graduated from Hampton Institute was during the American Reconstruction era after the Civil War. Here you see a picture of a freedom school where education was a prime concern for American society and government. And during that Reconstruction era, the government funded schools and resources to include the newly freed enslaved Africans into American society. As a national leader in education, Mr. Washington was invited to the White House by the president on October 16, 1901. He was recognized as a leader in education, in agriculture, and commerce for black people. More of the national context of Mr. Washington, his influence was across the nation for black colleges, including Mary McLeod Bethune was influenced by the head, heart, and hand method of Mr. Washington, as she included it in her logo, which you see on the screen above the picture where she is standing with Mr. Washington. In the local context, there were many high schools that were named in honor of Booker T. Washington. And here in Atlanta, the first high school for black people was built in 1924, and Atlanta's Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is a 1944 graduate of Booker T. Washington High School. More local context is Booker T. Washington spoke in Atlanta at Piedmont Park in 1895, and this speech brought criticism from black scholars like W.B. Du Bois, where he labeled the speech the Atlanta Compromise, saying that Mr. Washington's speech supported segregation. On this slide, we see a colorized picture of Mr. Washington in Piedmont Park, as well as a historical marker that is in Piedmont Park. One of the quotes from his speech in Atlanta was, "In all things social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet as the hand, yet one as the hand, in all things essential to mutual progress." It was that quote specifically that Mr. Washington was criticized for supporting separate but equal and supporting the inferior positioning of black people purported by white dominant society in America during that time of Reconstruction after the Civil War. Many other scholars also have a similar critique of Mr. Washington, including Dr. Claude Anderson in his book Powernomics. He says that Washington's greatest weakness was his dream of being the great accommodator between blacks and whites. Even Dr. Henry Louis Gates writes in his books, The Stoning the Road, that Washington essentially accepted Jim Crow or de jure segregation in social and political manners, with the hope that this accommodation would appease the radical segregationists and enable the mass of black people in the South slowly but steadily to achieve economic progress through manual labor and trades. A few points of clarity is that even though Booker T. Washington gave this speech to a majority white audience in Atlanta, Georgia, he was able to cultivate an extensive program at Tuskegee, which invited George Washington Carver to be a professor, where he was able to teach youth farming sciences and entrepreneurship. Booker T. Washington goes on to state that no race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling a field as in writing a poem. Uh, I believe that this is in response to some of his critique. And Booker T. Washington also says that there's a class of people who want to highlight the problems because it gets them a job. And Booker T. Washington wanted to focus on solving the problem. Also, Mr. Washington was effective in raising money from white philanthropists and partnering with American government through presidents to be able to fund his Tuskegee Institute to educate black youth. Here is another point of clarity for Booker T. Washington in response to the idea of supporting segregation. That Mr. Washington formed the National Negro Chamber of Commerce in 1900, and here's a picture of the National Negro Chamber at a meeting in Louisville, Kentucky in 1909. Laws of focus in this book are one is there are laws against literacy for reading for enslaved Africans in this nation. When Mr. Washington was a child, he was not allowed to read, but he was determined to. Another law of focus in this book is the 1896 Plessy versus Ferguson case that the Supreme Court nationalized racial segregation in public spaces. That racial segregation goes on to be present in effects of oppression on education and student opportunities in schools from K through 12, in that many schools are not funded properly, therefore are not able to provide children with the necessary education to be successful in society. As well, many children's behavior is heavily punished, is similar to heavily sentences in the courtrooms. And this punishment is a direct support of the school to prison pipeline. There are other effects of oppression in education on student opportunities. Is the president-elect mentioned that he plans to close the Department of Education. How will this affect student opportunities? There are many contemporary issues to connect to. Here you see an aerial view of Tuskegee University. And in light of this university and being a black college, we consider funding, we consider the educational and academic achievement that is made possible through funding so that the schools can have the resources to cultivate the academic excellence of black students. And as well, we even see gun violence at HBCUs. There's funding for land-grant colleges and HBCUs have been documented and underfunded. That this documentation shows that land-grant colleges have been underfunded to a tune of about $13 billion. Well, as we build on the message from the book, the good character with intelligence, agriculture, and industry will uplift humanity from any condition. We also see the establishment of institutions and organizations like the National Business League that Booker T. Washington founded. How can educators use this book to help students overcome? Educators can discuss with their students about Mr. Washington's drive to learn with character and cleanliness, help him overcome obstacles. They can also support student being involved in student government and connecting with local government to support student activities. Joining the PTSA is another excellent example for educators and parents to support student ability to advocate for themselves in the community. And joining social organizations is another key aspect that will allow students to be involved in communities so that they can articulate the goals for themselves. Here's a works cited page of resources that I used to make this presentation. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and be blessed.